Hi, everybody. Andre, you are very, very large, so you should just know that. You're the size of a human person, you know, a full human. I'll introduce myself, we'll talk a little bit about what this panel is about, and we'll jump into it. My name is Michael Zelenko. I am the deputy editor of Rest of World. It is a New York City-based media outlet that covers the impact of tech outside of the West. I am very honored and very excited to be joined on this panel by Andrey, who is the executive editor, editorial director of Ukrainskaya Pravda, one of the largest media organizations in the country. I know Andrey writes and thinks very deeply about the tech ecosystem and its impact on the journalism community in Ukraine. I'm also joined on the stage by Jane. Jane is a preeminent disinformation reporter who in many ways wrote the playbook for how disinformation reporting happens around the world now. The prompt for this conversation is, whose side is tech on? And for the purpose of this conversation, I'd really like to kind of think about tech in parallel to power, right? In the modern era, tech is a parallel to economic power, political power, social power. And for the purpose of this panel, it's also a parallel to the power to communicate, right, and storytelling. When you look at some of the biggest tech companies out there, and I'm mostly thinking about Google, Facebook, platforms that not only decide who gets to speak, but how they get to speak, who hears that speech, and honestly, what happens after they hear that speech as well. These platforms have an incredible amount of power in terms of how we communicate as storytellers. Initially, for this panel, we were just going to talk about Meta and Google, two companies that have an outsized impact on communication, but because he is unavoidable, we will also be talking about Elon Musk and Starlink. It's clear that access to Starlink is integral to communicating and storytelling, and that question of whose side is tech on is extremely pressing when we think about Starlink and Elon Musk, right? One individual who has the power to alter the reality on a battlefield, but also the reality of the stories that we hear and how they're told. So, all that said, I'm gonna start with a very, very basic question for Jane, which is, whose side is Elon Musk on?
When Michael said he was going to ask me this question, I told him I'm immediately going to pivot away from a concrete answer. Because it's, it's a fool's errand to guess whose side each tech billionaire is on. But increasingly over the years, we're asking the same question, which is, what does it mean for millionaires and billionaires to be in charge of vital communication infrastructure and play a decisive role in how that communication infrastructure impacts lives? So with the case of Elon Musk and Starlink, it's a bit of a new problem because the role that satellite companies have played and are playing in Ukraine is extremely important. It was important in the lead up to the full-scale invasion because private satellite companies and imagery showed us the buildup of forces, of Russian forces on Ukraine's border. And these private satellite companies also work a lot with reporters to try to uncover the situation on the ground, in many cases to provide proof of war crimes. Starlink also plays a pivotal role. Both the Ukrainian army and, from my understanding, Ukrainian journalists use Starlink to communicate and get information out of occupied territories or out of the front line or out of territories that have been recently deoccupied and don't have communication infrastructure. But at the same time, what Elon Musk reveals is a symptom of a bigger problem. which is that this vital communication infrastructure is very loosely governed, particularly satellite infrastructure. In preparation for this, I was looking at the international law around space communication, and it hasn't been updated since 1967, which seems like a few things have changed since then. And at the same time, there's very little that governments can do to supplement Starlink devices if Elon Musk decides to turn them off in vital areas of Ukraine. So all of that is to say, is to not answer your question. In not answering your question, I hope that what we can be thinking about is how do we ensure that vital communication infrastructure in Ukraine is stable and reliable, because it has become an incredibly important technology for Ukraine and Ukrainians to have on their side.
Great. Andrey, whose side is Elon Musk on?
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
Fine. Okay, great. I'm not going to answer the question as well, because obviously we cannot really know. But I think that the situation with Elon Musk and Starlink in Ukraine is very similar to what I've been observing as a media researcher for the last, I don't know, 8 years, looking at how a very effective technology, which at some point became very useful for a certain audience. In this case, it's like satellite communication technology that's being used by Ukrainian military and journalists and other people, but most importantly, the military forces. And this technology is very effective, and because of its efficiency, it very quickly became like a monopoly, and it's very easy at this point to be left at the whims of the technology holder, which is Elon Musk. And apart from Elon Musk, I mean, and when I was researching media, the same happened to the publishers who were bringing their businesses to Facebook in 2014, 2015, and suddenly who found themselves sidelined in 2018 and onward. So for me, this is a pretty similar situation with much more dangerous consequences in a very concrete geographic location, which is Ukraine. And also, I'm thinking, apart from like whose side Elon Musk is on, I'm also thinking about the other big tech representatives who are currently like saying that they are big partners of Ukraine, such as Palmer Luckey, for instance, with his military technology, and Peter Thiel with Palantir, like these, I don't know, also very efficient startups with called like Tolkien items from Tolkien books. They pose the same risks for us, but they are not this big as Starlinks, of course. So I think that the situation is very dangerous, and I also don't see a dangerous scenario of Elon Musk doing something with this power. I don't think that it's being discussed enough right now, because, okay, we are probably going to start paying to Elon Musk's company for the service, but if he's not treating Ukraine as an ally, or he's not fully on our side, what is he going to do with the data he has. And this also brings us back to the time when Facebook and publishers stopped being allies. So for me, this is like part of the very big problem of monopolies in the technologies sector.
Thanks. We're off to a good start. Neither of you want to answer my questions, but that's okay. Andrey, when we had a conversation a few weeks ago, you told a really interesting story about your family members, and I wonder if you could share it with the audience here. And the story really kind of encapsulates a lot of what we're talking about. Not necessarily Elon Musk, not necessarily Starlink, but more so regarding platforms, the kind of stories that are being told, the kind of stories that aren't being told. And yeah, Andrey, did you want to share that story?
Yeah. My relatives, I'm originally from Mykolaiv, which is a city in the southern Ukraine, which is currently being heavily shelled. And in the previous months, it has been heavily attacked by the Russian forces. And my wife is from Mykolaiv as well, so at one point we had to evacuate our family from there, and I went from Kiev to Mykolaiv to evacuate my wife's grandparents. And as I was helping them to carry their stuff to the car, I also decided that we are going to take their smart TV set for them to be able to watch TV in Kiev more easily. And I noticed, and the TV was on, and we were packing the stuff, and the TV was on, and I noticed that my wife's grandparents were using the Facebook or the YouTube app for smart TV, and it was like playing some playlist which was like very deep into pro-Russian propaganda channels, like saying that US should kneel to Putin and so on. So it was like very heavy pro-Russian content, which we haven't really realized that our grandparents are being like heavily consuming in the very, vulnerable region, which is like heavily attacked by the Russians. So as we were physically evacuating them from under attack, they were also like being attacked on the communication level, on the media level. And I know that we are going to talk about that further, but I think that YouTube and Google in general is not getting enough bashing for that, because less attention is paid to what's going on YouTube than on Facebook and Meta platforms. So yeah, that was like a story when I thought that, okay, maybe we should pay more attention to what's going on YouTube, and especially what our relatives and we consume on that platform.
Yeah, and the reason I think that anecdote is actually so gripping to me is because it offers kind of a two-sided view of these platforms, right? It's not only the kind of classic traditional journalism ecosystem that these platforms undermine and destroy, but it is also gives into that vacuum, they allow disinformation, bad actors, all kinds of materials, and I think that's really, really compelling. Andrey, could you tell us a little bit about the state of Ukraine's media ecosystem and how much of it is actually dependent on platforms like Meta and Google, both for monetization but also distribution?
Yeah, sure. Well, I worked mainly on audience development and content distribution roles before joining Ukrainska Pravda. So I worked in that a lot, and currently the Ukrainian media ecosystem is really dependent on the platforms. So if you take an average website, media website in Ukraine, it would get around like 30 to 40% traffic from Facebook on its website, and 50 to 70% of traffic from Google Search and Google Discover, and a little bit from Google News. Unless it's like a very old and very reputable publication, websites in Ukraine don't get a lot of direct traffic, so they are mostly dependent on traffic from Facebook and Google products, which is also like a kind of dangerous situation. But I mean, in the last 5 to 8 years, it hasn't really changed. So although the portion of Facebook input in that is changing from time to time, but this pretty much remains within these proportions.
And can you talk a little bit about how the war itself has challenged or undermined that distribution on Facebook specifically, and it's made it more difficult?
Yeah, so Facebook has made like several attempts to publicly state its policy changes in the course of the war, but at the same time, the public policy and standards enforced by Facebook are not fully clear. And it hit both local and national level Ukrainian media really hard, especially when during the siege of Azovstal plant, when the Ukrainian media had to report a lot about the Azov battalion, which is still on the dangerous organizations list that is used by Facebook. And the Ukrainian publications got a lot of strikes for basically reporting the news related to the Azov battalion, and their pages had limited organic reach because of that, or they lost access to Facebook monetization tools. And actually, like right before our call, I checked with like the latest data. I also work with Media Development Foundation, which is a local NGO working with local independent news publishers. And we are actually preparing a report about the state of Facebook and media relations in Ukraine. And out of 57 independent local news publishers that we supported for that report, 37% have either fully limited pages, like the red status of the page, or the yellow status of the page, which partially limits organic reach and limits monetization options. So more than a third of independent local publishers in Ukraine are actually currently affected by bans, most of which are related to their simply reporting the news and not being able to directly appeal on their status to Facebook News Partnerships team. So yeah, so and we haven't really surveyed the national level publications, but I know several big national level media that have the same problems, and Ukrainska Pravda itself was under this ban for June and July, which also affected our reach on Facebook and the reach of the website as well.
And I'm sure there's plenty of Georgian journalists in the room who have their own horror stories from their newsrooms about the impact of these platforms. And I want to save a little bit of time at the end of our panel so we can hear those voices and hear some of those concerns. But Andrey and Jane, I wonder, taking Azov Battalion as a very specific example, why are we seeing this? Is there, going back to that question of whose side is tech on, I don't know if it's really that Facebook doesn't want any news about the Azov Battalion, right? Rather, they don't have the resources in order to figure out what's good, what isn't. They use just a big hammer to block all of it. And I wonder whether you can speak a little bit to what this says about kind of broader resource allocation of Facebook to the kind of journalism ecosystem in Ukraine, or the lack thereof, right? Either one of you.
Well, I think what Andrey is describing is part of a bigger problem and a consistent cycle that we see with social media companies and communications companies when it comes to various crises. In Ukraine, of course, it's quite pronounced because it's a hot war, and a lot of lives and our understanding of the war is dependent on a functional communication infrastructure. But the cycle that we see regularly from social media companies is when a crisis happens, they throw all of their resources and all of their enforcement to look like they are addressing the issue. So we saw this early on after February 24th, right, where Twitter and Facebook and Google were sort of attempting to allocate resources to scale back disinformation on their platforms in various forms and to try to amplify legitimate voices. But that will very quickly wears off, and the policies that they create early on in crises are almost never enforced as the crisis goes on. I think that we saw this in a very pronounced way when the COVID pandemic just began, right? We saw the exact same pattern of social media companies saying we will not allow for fake cures and disinformation and all of these issues on our platforms, but then, of course, look at social media now, right? Look at the social media environment now. And the other part of it that I think Andrey hits on very effectively is that social media companies are very selective with where they allocate resources. So I think it's very important to know that it's not that they do not have resources to allocate. These are million and billion-dollar companies. They have the resources. But they choose to allocate their resources in their most profitable markets. This is primarily English-speaking markets. This is primarily Western markets. And we can't actually really answer the question of how many resources they allocate per market because they keep those that information under wraps. So early on in the war, I reached out to YouTube to try to understand how many moderators or policy enforcement people they had that worked on Ukraine, and they would not give me an answer. They refused to give you an answer. And so we don't know how many resources they're allocating to an active war. We don't know how much their policy is enforced. And on top of that, each of these companies has different policies. And each of these companies has their own approaches, if we can call it that, to both amplifying correct information, accurate information, and with battling disinformation on their platforms. But as we know, information is not platform agnostic, right? It moves from platform to platform. And so what we see is this gap in enforcement allows for bad actors to have the luxury of spinning up quick properties, right? Quick YouTube pages or Facebook accounts or Twitter accounts to forward their message, while legitimate publishers in Ukraine cannot use the same deceptive tactics and are stuck in this policy enforcement whirlwind, right? This closed cycle that Andrey describes where they can't get a real person. But of course, you know, a Ukrainian news outlet is not going to create a bunch of fake accounts to promote its message to avoid policy enforcement the same way that bad actors and propagandists do.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And Andrey, could you speak to how much access do you have and how many resources do you have to these companies? You know, as a publisher, as someone who's so deeply involved in the journalism ecosystem, if you're facing an issue with monetization, what does it take to get a response from a company like Facebook or Meta or Google?
Well, I'm obviously not a good representative for this information because I run a very big publication that has like a lot of reach, and I'm usually getting a much quicker response than a smaller publication would get from any platform. But at the same time, I mean, even the response that I'm getting is usually it's coming from a very small team called news publishers that we are speaking about, Facebook, and the news partnerships team that is responsible for our region is like several people. And when we speak about Facebook or Google or any other big tech company allocating resource, I really tried to understand how this can happen, and I really can't, because hiring even like 10 more people to address these issues would like make tremendous change for all the local publishers. And same concerns moderation, which I think it's mostly right now outsourced to third-party contractors still, even despite all those reports about horrendous conditions of working there. So I really can't understand why, even on the ad hoc basis, the big tech companies cannot resolve these issues, because currently to get a response on a matter like if your page is banned and you're a local publisher or just a publisher in Ukraine, you should have, you can either write to like customer support, which mostly is useless, and you can also, you may have an email, like a direct email of people on the news partnerships team, which, as I wrote on Twitter, is like it's passed around like sacred knowledge between media managers, like a couple of emails of people who are responsible for our region. And I don't think that it's proper handling of the situation, like of a country which, as a matter of fact, has like 16 million users for meta platforms. I don't think that it's right. As Jane said, yeah, we are not a highly prioritized market because we don't have a big economy, we don't have a lot of big spenders in terms of advertising, which is why there's hardly going to be any like significant expansion of Facebook offices or anything in the near future. But still, I think that the reputation damage that Facebook is having, or at least like the reputation damage inside the Ukrainian media community, could be avoided by additional investment in these teams. And also, as Jane said, like they were very quick, all those platforms, they were very quick to respond early in the war to limit the reach of pro-Russian propaganda. But the problem is that they simply limited the reach of the pro-Russian propaganda. They haven't banned any pages. You can still, if you have a VPN, you can still access these properties, which also doesn't make sense, because people running these pages like Russia Today, they're sanctioned by the US government. A lot of the media managers in the Russian propaganda machine are sanctioned. So it doesn't make sense that they are still on the platform and they are producing fake content, which has been verified that it's fake by the verification centers that Facebook funds as well. So the Facebook itself has verified that these outlets are fake. They're producing fake content, and still they remain on the platform. I have checked recently the reach of Russia Today related pages, and the Russia Today Arabic services, Serbian services, are still very active, and they're getting thousands and hundreds of thousands interaction per month. So, and I have there is no reason why they are still there. And same concerns Google. I think that pretty much everything is the same there.
Yeah, and I think this question of moderation, resource allocation is so important because you see this time and time again that it does have life and death impacts, right? If you look at what happened in Myanmar, what happened around the Kenya elections, over and over, it comes down to a failure to allocate resources appropriately, which seems like a technical decision, but it can actually have a very, very significant impact. What's interesting is, so the flip side of having legitimate news operations flagged or demonetized or limited is it creates a void, and into this void we see the rise of disinformation campaigns. And Jane, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what are kind of the most potent disinformation campaigns that are emerging on these platforms, and how are they operating not just on one platform, but kind of in the ecosystem of platforms and kind of jumping between each other?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things that are very important to understand about disinformation and propaganda campaigns. And it's that part of it is, of course, fake information and totally made up information. But the other part of it is aiming to create division and create arguments. So the way in which it functions is it finds ready-made audiences, and it essentially ignites the most complicated issues within those audiences. So it's not like, you know, Putin is logging on to Facebook and says, like, vote for me, right? Or like, go Russia. No, a lot of the disinformation campaigns are micro-targeted or are targeted to specific audiences in specific regions. And they are not necessarily only fake information, but a lot of it is manipulating real information and half-truths. And here, it's important to understand the role of both fake online properties, fake accounts, but also real propagandists who broadcast to thousands across different social media. So right before this, I wanted to check a few prominent pro-Russian propagandists and whether their content, the information that they provide is available on social media platforms. So I checked Patrick Lancaster and a man who goes by the name of War Gonzo across social media companies. And they both broadcast on YouTube. They both monetize on Patreon. They both have dedicated Telegram channels that have vast audiences, and their content is available both on Twitter and on Facebook. All of these companies have different policy enforcements, but all of them are hosting Russian propagandists actively, even as they say that they are fighting Russian propaganda. And I'm really glad that Andrey brought up YouTube at the beginning, because setting aside the individual propagandists, you can watch this really interesting pattern with YouTube channels where there's a YouTube channel that's created in 2014. And first it posts a bunch of false information about Crimea. Then it posts a bunch of false information about MH17. Then it goes quiet for 8 years, and then it becomes live and starts posting a bunch of false information about the full-scale invasion. And it's not a mystery what this channel's purpose is, right? It's not difficult to figure out why this channel exists. But these gaps in enforcement and this lack of oversight, not just from social media companies, but even these crowdfunding companies, which I think are another blind spot for reporting in this issue, are creating a very ripe environment for disinformation and misinformation and propaganda to spread. And in order to understand the disinformation problem, we can't only be looking at individual social media companies. We have to be looking at the communication environment as a whole, from smart TVs, as Andrey described at the beginning, to fake accounts on Twitter, so both the big picture and the little picture, because they're not operating in silos.
I do want to, I think that's a really good point, and I'm also kind of interested as a really broad topic in terms of how do you moderate across platforms, right? How do you create, like, is there a unified body that we create? Maybe that's something we can touch on. I do want to leave a little bit of room and time for journalists in the room to speak about their experience with Facebook, with moderation, with YouTube, with disinformation here in Georgia. I think we have about 10 minutes. So maybe let's go to questions, and if anybody has any comments, questions, or even just kind of stories of your experience in your newsroom dealing with these platforms, I think that'd be really valuable.
Thank you. Hi, I don't think I have a question, but I do have a story. I'm a chief digital editor for Formula TV, which is one of the leading TV stations in Georgia, and we have had a horrible experience with Facebook when covering the war. Actually, because of covering the war in Ukraine, we are kind of punished right now, and we lost major part of our reach, which was like we were leaders for a year in Georgia among the TV stations, and after we started covering the war, and I don't need to explain why is it so important to cover what's going on in Ukraine, especially in Georgia, and all eyes are on Ukraine here, and we have been following it like on daily basis, 24 hours a day. We did not sleep, and not only they like covered our photos or videos because like they considered it to be sensitive, to be seen, the reality of war, what's going on in Ukraine. Well, I don't think we should be so sensitive about seeing the reality, but that's okay, that's not the worst part. The worst part is we actually got so-called strikes for violating community standards, and we never violated community standards. And I'm going to give you one example which shows how crazy it has been. So we had a quote by President Zelensky, and he was addressing to the mothers of Russian soldiers. Maybe you remember the statement. And it was branded by Facebook as hate speech. So they told us, you are spreading hate speech. And it was not even a quote from us. It was a quote from President Zelensky. It was just a translation in the caption sections. And they decided it's a hate speech. And there have been so many examples like that. And you kind of have an opportunity to dispute the strikes, but you don't, because you don't have any direct communication with them. You just write to them, and you might not never get an answer. And there have been like so many strikes, and once you are in so-called red zone, then you get more and more strikes, because if people keep reporting you like trolls and bots in Georgia, and we have our government as an enemy, they have like whole factory of trolls and bots here. It's a small country, but they learn from the best. Like they have like Russian practices in place, and of course they would keep reporting our posts. And I think at some point we lost 80% of our reach, and it has been better, but it's not getting as better as it was before. So we tried to communicate with them like through other means, and Natalia put me in touch with some people, and yeah, there have been some improvements, but still we cannot go back to the results we had. So that's our story.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think it does go back to that issue of resource allocation, but also how so many of these platforms actually act to polarize, right? No matter how nuanced your reporting can be, it can be flagged for a simple term and then demonetized, which can have a massive, massive impact on your newsroom, which only just kind of encourages your newsroom to be more polarized, to be more basic, to lack that nuance, right? Just so you can avoid being punished.
And it also speaks to the double standard of these companies. I covered the US for a long time, and something that became very clear is that certain organizations in the US had exceptions from the sort of strike-based policy enforcement that we're talking about here. And the people that those exceptions applied to included conspiracy theorists. Of course, they included Donald Trump. And they included people who spread false information. And so the question is, why is that allowed in a US-based market? And at the same time, the smaller markets are not afforded even a conversation about how a legitimate news outlet would be covering a war, when yes, there will be certainly graphic imagery because it is a war, and there will be situations where policy enforcement will be challenged because war is unpredictable and new policies will have to be written. So it, I think, once again speaks to the priority of these social media companies. And maybe to answer the overarching question of this panel, whose side is tech on, I think the increasing evidence is the side on financial profit, right?
Are there any other questions?
I think you can hear me now. Yeah. Michael, I wanted to ask you this. You mentioned resource allocation a couple of times, and as Jane said, there is clearly no lack of resources with Facebook and other big platforms. So that's my question. Is it really the problem of resource allocation, or is it the business model of the Facebook that we're dealing with? And also, if you could clarify what is the resource allocation, is it the problem of them not having enough resources, or is it the problem of them prioritizing wrong things, basically? That's my question.
I mean, I think to Jane's point, there is no shortage of resources with these companies, and it is a financial decision. So resource allocation is a financial decision, right? It's what you're going to invest money in, and you see over and over Facebook, Google investing the majority of their resources in Western markets. They are more profitable for them. I think it would be fair to say that they care less what happens in other markets because it impacts their bottom line less. Is that a healthy model for platforms that control how we communicate, how we flex political power, social power? I would emphatically say no. I think there's one more question in the middle.
Thank you. When talking about social media platforms, you listed so many issues, like they have some policies while crisis or war, but they are not implementing them. We do not know how the resources are allocated. They do not answer the questions. There are some scandals related to corruption. If you were talking about the country with those indicators, what would you call this kind of political system in the country? Thank you.
I'll pass that to either of you, Andrey.
I would call it oligarchy, maybe. I don't know. I'm not a good political expert for that. I'm a philologist. So, ask me about literature, please.
Jane, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think oligarchy is right, and I think one of the issues that you hit on is that unlike with when we cover governments, where even the most corrupt of governments, there's people responsible for certain functions of that government. There's documentation. There's freedom of information laws in many cases. A lot of these companies are quite closed and lack transparency. And so although Facebook and Google are both US-based company, you can't file a freedom of information request to get documents out of these companies, right? Despite the fact that Facebook has or claims to have at least 3 billion users, right? Which would, if it were a country, blows every other country or region out of the water. And so the question of governance of speech and even whether we look at these companies as an entity with political power, I think is very topical. Yeah.
Okay. One more question, or?
So we hear many stories and cases, and we see it by ourselves. To say the least, we are convinced that there is big problems in this subject. But what about solutions? Does anyone has any idea what can be done to make tech to be on the right side?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch it. So, to be on the right side of?
What can be a solution for this? All problems we discussed.
Well, we have 3 minutes, so let's come up with the solution. Either of you, do you want to jump in?
Well, we talked about the resources, so obviously a lot could be done with more resources allocated to crisis-hit regions of the world, and as I said, hiring 10 more people in media partnerships could make a big difference. Same concerns moderation, more clear moderation policies. Also, I mean, right now the Facebook Oversight Board is more like a PR stunt than an actual body. It could be reformed, or Facebook could provide a better instrument to address the issues. So that's just to start, and Facebook could work with both local and international fact-checking orgs better and more efficiently. It could make a wide list of independent publishers, also with both local and international news organizations and news watchdogs. So just a will to address these issues is not present, and it could make tremendous change.
I'll add to that journalism is definitely one of the solutions. What you describe in your newsroom is a story. It's not just your own personal experience. It is something that your audiences need to understand, and global audiences need to understand, and policymakers, especially US policymakers who are primarily responsible for US-based companies, need to understand. And so coverage, investigative coverage of these platforms, I think is quite important. And although the changes over the last 5-10 years in how these platforms function have been incremental, the majority of changes that did happen that were positive were not a result of policy makers and lawmakers, but were a result of responses to journalists and responses to investigations. I think the other thing that's important for us to think about is what does an ideal social media platform look like? If civil society leaders and tech leaders globally were to build a social media company that embodied the sort of ideals that we wanted them to embody, what would that look like, and how could it be made possible? We are getting an increasingly fractured social media environment. Although Facebook is still king in many markets, we increasingly see new entrants being effective at gaining audiences. And maybe one of the questions for tech entrepreneurs and civil society within our own countries is it possible to create social media that competes with other social media companies and embodies the sort of ideals that we want them to embody?
And I think just on that point, I would add that when we kind of come back to the central question of the panel, whose side is tech on, I think it's fair to say that it's not on our side. And by our side, I mean the general population. And I think so much of that has to do with the rise of these companies and the power of these companies, right? Going back to the power, economic power, political power, social power, communication power. It is extremely, extremely centralized, and I think we've seen a dearth of legislation and regulation globally to manage and kind of and actually cope with what these companies have the power to do. I think that might be a good point to end on. I think we're at time. So, Andrey, Jane, thank you so much for joining me. And thank you to everybody here.